Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome back. Today I'm happy to introduce to you a brand new series that's going to be running alongside my Beowulf and Boethius series. The Beowulf and Boethius series will be running on Mondays, and on Thursdays, I'm going to be running material from Josh Traylor's Paradise Lost course, which he taught through and for Mythic Mind in 2025. And he has very graciously given me permission to share this with you, and so I hope that you will pick up Paradise Lost, whether you've read it before or you've never touched it before, and maybe it seemed a little bit intimidating to you, and it would be helpful to you to have a guide. This is a good time to pick it up and to read. And so every Thursday on my YouTube channel, as well as through the Mythic Mind podcast, I'll be providing material from his course. Today, we're going to be taking a look at an introduction to Paradise Lost. I hope you enjoy.
Good day, everybody. So today, this is going to be the biggest video for the introductory portion of this course. This video is simply an introduction to Paradise Lost itself. Already talked about the life of John Milton, the historical context. Now we're going to get into talking about just a sweeping overview of the text itself. So where I wanted to start with that was with some of the influences on Paradise Lost. Like any other great work, or even not great work, Paradise Lost was written. It was written in a context, right? It was written with not just a historical context, but within a tradition and a literary canon, with philosophical influences and different paradigms of thought. So we need to talk about how those things have influenced this, just very briefly and at a high level. So first and foremost, the number one influence on Paradise Lost should obviously be the Bible, Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, though there's going to be more allusions to the Old Testament. It's all one cohesive work, and Milton is going to see it that way, and they're a redemptive historical narrative that runs throughout Scripture, which he will absolutely talk about, especially towards the end of Paradise Lost in the last two books. So Milton is a Christian. Sometimes even Milton scholars, the secular ones, don't understand this point. We see this sometimes with Dante too, where there's just so many misreadings that come from people not understanding Orthodox Christianity, not specific denominational Christianity, but the theology of the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition and things that would be seen as historic Christian core beliefs. So people not understanding these things often limits their interpretation of something like Paradise Lost. But nevertheless, Milton was influenced by those things. Milton was an Orthodox Christian. The work De Doctrina Christiana, which I'll get to talking about in a different video, sometimes seems to reveal that he was heretical in some ways, being Arian, which, again, we can talk about that later if you don't know what that is. But there's a lot of things we don't know about that work. It's hard to say what Milton was doing with it, and it was written at the end of his life. So Paradise Lost is absolutely written from the perspective of Orthodox Christianity. There's way too much to unpack and comb through there for this video, but just know that. And certainly if you don't see it that way during the class, please feel free to ask questions and bring it up, and we will have a good, healthy dialogue about that. The main foundation for this poem, of course, is going to be Genesis chapters 1 through 3 in the biblical canon. So this is going to be foundational for the entire poem because there's events that take place before Genesis 1 and events that take place after the fall in Genesis 3. And the Archangel Michael at the end of this poem is going to explain to Adam the history that takes place throughout the Old and New Testament. But Genesis 1 to 3 are the main backdrop. I highly, highly recommend that you are reading and meditating on God's Word, especially Genesis 1 through 3, throughout this entire class, and just seeing the pieces connecting there, and trying to see what Milton's doing with the imagination and with the questions he's asking there, things that Scripture doesn't clearly answer for us, and God certainly is not required to answer all of our questions and provide more, right? He revealed to us what he chose to. But these questions are good to ask, they're interesting, they can even be helpful for the Christian life, and Milton's working with that. So another thing is just the Exodus journey. There's going to be kind of this pattern of the Exodus journey with this, the social context and the journey through the wilderness. Just important to keep that in the back of your mind as well. In Paradise Lost, it starts with Promised Land, Eden, and it ends with wilderness, exile from Eden because of the fall, where Michael has to kick them out of Eden because of them being sinful now. And that's sort of like almost like a reverse Exodus, where like they're in the Promised Land and then they leave the Promised Land. Whereas if you know the Exodus story, they're in Egypt. Moses leads them out of Egypt through the wilderness. Doesn't actually enter the Promised Land. That's going to be Joshua and Caleb's journey in the book of Joshua, right after the Torah in the English Bible. But nevertheless, we see those patterns. It's almost like a reverse Exodus in a way. So just keeping that in mind as well. There's certainly theme and influence there. All right, so most important influence is the Bible, no question about it. Just the history of the theology of the Christian Church as well, just broadly speaking in terms of orthodoxy and Catholicity. But outside of Christian influences, the biggest influence is going to be the epic poets, the great epic poets of our Western canon. So the first, really, maybe usually considered the first literary author of our Western canon is Homer. Homer writing out of usually roughly 800 BC, maybe sometimes dated all the way back to 1000 BC, being the first person to write down the oral tradition of the Trojan Wars, which occurred before all of that. And so we see so many Homeric styles and themes and conceptions throughout Paradise Lost. No doubt Milton is writing intentionally this as an epic, not any other type of poem or any other type of narrative. He's specifically trying to write a great epic here, and I believe, of course, he accomplishes that, as many would agree. But there's going to be influences here. So we're going to see at one point in Paradise Lost, I cannot remember the exact book off the top of my head. It might be like book 4 or 5, maybe even 6. But somewhere in the middle of Paradise Lost, there's going to be a recounting of the story of the war between the rebellious angels, aka the fallen angels and the demons, Satan being their leader. Satan, once Lucifer, the unfallen angel, leads the rebellion against God, who he sees as a tyrant. And the military conflict recounted here is very, very, very much in the style of many of the passages in the Iliad. If you've ever read the Iliad, and if you haven't, I'll tell you now, there is a lot of warfare in the Iliad. There's a lot of military conflict. There's a lot of descriptions of battle scenes. This is very, you might see this in some like modern, like modern fantasy stories or something here and there. But other than that, you don't really see a lot of battle scenes. There's a section of Paradise Lost that really pays homage to Homer in a way, talking about the battle between God's angels who remain faithful to him and those who fall away from God and his grace. Another Homeric convention is the idea of really the action being split into two. So you kind of have this hero's peril and social context or quest theme, and then the setting of social order in a way. So in the Odyssey, you have first Odysseus and the hero's journey is his journey back to Ithaca from the Trojan War. Ithaca is his homeland. He is the king of that. He's trying to return. And he's going to get back there, and he has to establish social order because he's been gone for a long time, and he has a wife and a son named Telemachus, who are going to be, he has to reorder his house, the oikos, and he has to reorder the polis, his city-state. Those are themes in this two-part epic of the Odyssey. And you kind of see that in a little bit with Paradise Lost in some ways or another. You're going to kind of see things taking place really before the fall and after the fall, but really Milton says that book seven um, is where the rest of the poem is, and he shows us that the poem is confined to Earth, basically from book seven on, where a lot of things are taking place outside of Earth from the perspective of God and the perspective of Satan in the first half of Paradise Lost, books one through six. Um, so we kind of have this twofold way where it's almost like two arcs, maybe in a way. You see this also in Virgil as well. So in the Aeneid, the action is split into two. The first part of the Aeneid is Aeneas journeying out of Troy, which has been sacked, sieged, and destroyed. And he's going to be taking his journey, fulfilling his destiny to establish what eventually becomes Rome and the Roman Republic, and then later the Roman Empire. And he moves out of the Italian peninsula and or moves out of Troy to the Italian peninsula. And then when he gets to the Italian peninsula, he has to set some sort of social order there, and has conflict with all of the different Italian warlords. And that's what the second half of the Aeneid is about. It's him establishing that and then receiving this prophecy that, one day from this, Romulus and Remus are going to be, born from Rhea Silvia. They are going to be nursed by the she-wolf, and they are going to one day establish Rome, and Romulus is going to be the first king of Rome. If you've never read Livy specifically, the Roman author, that's a great place to read all of that at. As a kind of, I guess, as like a sequel to the Aeneid. Um, okay, so that's one aspect. Another aspect that we absolutely need to talk about is this epic convention of media res. So media res is basically it's Latin for in the middle of things. And what this is going to mean is that we don't get the story from the beginning. The Iliad does not take place at the beginning of the Trojan War. It takes place at the end. It takes place in year 10 of 10, really towards the very end of the war, leading up to finally sacking the city of Troy, which is what the entire war was about for 10 years anyway. And we see the same thing in the Odyssey, where Odysseus, we do not start with Odysseus. We don't start with him at Troy, like right after the sack, and him with his military platoon, but we see him on Calypso's island. So we wonder what happened there. Homer doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us what happens at the beginning of for most of the Trojan War. Though there's references and allusions to things, a lot of that is left open. And we see the same thing with the Aeneid in a sense as well, where he starts at the destruction of Troy, not before that, goes on a journey, and then ends in New Troy, what eventually becomes Rome. And here's where we're going to see this in Paradise Lost. It opens, and you might expect, I'm not sure what you would expect, to be honest, but perhaps you might expect that it'll start with the battle, or that it'll start with creation. But it doesn't. It starts with Satan and his demons waking up basically in hell. They're going to wake up by the lake of fire in hell. They've already lost the war. It's going to be recounted later. This is an epic convention. It's the media res. Satan's in the middle of things. He hasn't gotten to Eden to tempt and corrupt Earth and humanity yet. But he has already lost the fight. He's already lost that battle. And this is the media res. That's where Paradise Lost begins. Undoubtedly, this is where John Milton is pulling these from, and I believe that is completely intentional at the end of the day. Certainly an epic convention. A couple other influences I just want to mention here is the Ecclesiastical History by Caedmon. This is basically just a medieval text recounting the history of the English Church. And this is where Milton's going to draw a lot of his British history from, and his invocation of the Muse. That's going to be another epic convention here where, you think like Sing to Me, O Muse in Homer. He's going to invoke the Muse, and this is the Muse of all muses. It's the Holy Spirit. You're going to see that right at the beginning of Book 1. But Caedmon famously claimed to have talked to an angel before he wrote this, and whatever angel that was supposedly supposed to be his muse, another key epic convention. Another one is, it'd be hard to mention an English epic without mentioning the Arthurian legend. Um, the works of, Sir Thomas Malory being the most profound, but other ones, of course, like Geoffrey of Monmouth and other medieval texts as well. But we see themes of chivalry, a very key theme in the Arthurian legend, and we see those in Paradise Lost, especially as Eve falls, and they have to leave Eden and go on a journey, just the two of them, because no other humans exist yet. And Adam failed at chivalry in a sense, but he still has to aim at the good of chivalry in a way to lead his wife, start a family with her, and properly lead the people um, after falling from Eden. He's promised of this future hope, like the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent, and so with that theological virtue of hope, he's going to carry on out there from that hope he's been given by Michael, who was sent by God, and he's going to have to really have these masculine and chivalric virtues as he properly leads his woman and his family through the new world, the fallen world, which they will inhabit and dwell in from here on out. Milton actually wanted to write his own Arthurian epic. He toyed around with the idea as for the great English epic, but he ended up writing Paradise Lost instead. Alfred Lord Tennyson in the late 19th century would take up the mantle of doing so with his Idylls of the King, which was written and published throughout the second half of the 19th century. Other influences were just medieval courtly love poetry, so this was kind of just like don't think of this as like a romance, like a soap opera or a romantasy book or anything that we would associate with romance in our time. I certainly can be quite critical of those things, and in some ways we should be, because I don't think they portray love and romance and such things very well. But courtly love poetry did portray these things in a more wholesome and, I think, true way, and we see this even influence with Dante and the way that he talks about Beatrice in the Divine Comedy, certainly influenced by Italian and French courtly love poetry, and Milton's going to be drawing on these things as well. There's a lot to say about the connection between Milton and Dante. Hopefully talk about that at some point, but just time permitting, because there's a lot there as well. There's many questions of there, and wondering if he actually, was alluding to Dante in any way, or whether he read Dante, whether he liked him, whether he saw them as like somebody he was challenging for the Laurel crown in a sense. A lot there. I'm not gonna digress into that right now, but I hope we can talk about it at some point. And one last piece I want to hit on here as far as literary influences. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are certainly many, many, many more. But the concept of a Socratic dialogue. A lot of the dramatic scenes you're going to see where characters are dialoguing with one another, it's usually one character talking to another for pretty much the entirety of the poem. And you see this especially in a scene where Raphael is educating Adam, trying to prepare him and educate him properly to be virtuous and not take the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and to also lead his wife to not do the same. That's going to be a key component here. But like the way even Satan just talking to his demons, or Adam and Eve talking to one another, Michael and Adam talking at the end of the poem, these all have a very Socratic dialogue feel. And if you've never read the dialogues of Plato, there's certainly a couple that are absolute essential reads, absolute essential parts of the Western canon, one of the most important authors of all time, in my opinion. And I think in the opinions of many, I don't think that's even much of an opinion, practically a fact. So, moving out of influences, I would like to talk about the poem itself, the text of the poem. So, what's the style here? Well, first of all, it's going to be iambic pentameter blank verse. So this is just a poetry way of method of doing things. Sorry, losing my voice here a little bit. But it's going to be a 5-foot line, and it's going to be essentially just like 10 syllables long. So you can count it out. Da-da, 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 da-da. You see that a lot in Shakespeare, right? Like, to be or not to be, that is the question. You're going to see this same convention, Milton coming right out of the English Renaissance, as Shakespeare was one of the predominant authors of that. But more than iambic pentameter, I want to focus on the idea of blank verse here. So, blank verse essentially means that it doesn't rhyme. Milton saw this as extremely vulgar. He did not see it as fitting the epic convention, and he actually wanted poetry to move away from rhyming and this idea of like these couplets, the suffix of one line rhyming with the suffix of the next line. He wanted to move away from that entirely. And we certainly see that a lot in the English poetic tradition. People think about poetry and they're like, it rhymes. George Lucas, of course, once said, it's like poetry, it rhymes. This isn't exactly what he was talking about, but poetry doesn't rhyme a lot of the time. That's a common misconception. And Milton was trying to move away from that. And so there's no rhyming scheme here. There's no rhyming scheme in Homer. There's not a rhyming scheme in Virgil or Ovid, the main epic poets of the classical Greco-Roman world. In fact, same thing with Beowulf, right? We really only see this in Dante, in a sense, with his terza rima rhyme scheme, which I'm not going to digress to explain what that means, but Dante had a very specific rhyme scheme, and he used that, and you see that in the original Italian. But Milton's not going with that. He's not going to do the same thing that Dante was trying to do in Italy in the early 14th century. Milton's going back past Dante to the epics that previously named. So he's going to write it in blank verse. So don't expect rhymes, and don't get hung up on rhyming being, essential to poetry. It just is not. That in the history of the English poetic tradition, as well as other poetic traditions, just shows that it's just not true. It's not an essential component or element of poetry. So beyond style, let's talk about some themes here for a minute. So first theme, and I'm just going to list some themes, not unpack them too heavily. I'm going to also, after this, pose some questions to be chewing on throughout the play, or throughout the drama, the poem. There's a lot of things you kind of classify this as. Milton was also influenced by dramatic elements, by the way, like think of like Sophocles or Euripides or Shakespeare, of course, others. But just think about these themes and these questions. If you have to, just type them out on a separate Word document, write them down somewhere in a journal or a notebook, just have them on hand, because you're going to want to see where these things are coming alive all throughout. So I'm just going to list some here. One theme: obedience to God and the consequences of disobedience. Another theme: divine justice and divine love, and how those things are interrelated to one another. In fact, as a Christian, you kind of have to come to the terms to agree that they're completely inseparable in a way. Third theme: the revelation between general or natural revelation and its fulfillment from special revelation, aka what God provided us in Scripture, and general revelation being one and connected to special revelation, these things being tied together, but special revelation further telling us specifically from God how to understand his word, but also natural order and creation, which is all around us. And we see this a lot in the Christian humanist tradition. Again, think Myth Became Fact, the famous C.S. Lewis essay. Think On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. I could name a few more, but I won't. But Milton is absolutely in this tradition, and it only takes reading the first, 30 or 40 lines of Paradise Lost to see this. Basically, his preamble to the whole poem. Another theme: the relationship between divine providence and free will. Milton was a Puritan. Is he a Calvinist? Is he Arminian? Is he something else? Because those aren't the only two views of this in the grand theological tradition. And there's mystery and paradox there pretty much no matter how you slice it. So how does Milton deal with that? Excellent thing to ponder throughout the poem. Think about how he's doing that. Is Adam responsible? Is Eve responsible? Is God responsible? Does he blame God in some way? He does not, but you will see how he deals with all of that in the poem. Another theme, another goes hand in hand with the last one, is the problem of evil. A how does a good, loving, all powerful, all knowing God um, exist in a world where evil also exists? Is it his fault that evil exists? Is it man's fault? How does that all reconcile out? How do we deal with that? And Milton's poem is kind of one giant theodicy, or way of justifying the ways of God to men, defending the problem of evil in a sense. So all things to consider there. Another big one for Milton is the relationship between monarchy, liberty, and tyranny. Milton was very, very, very libertarian in a sense in his time. He was very pro liberty, pro freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, freedom of religion. He was very against the monarchy in his life. He saw monarchy as tyrannical. He even saw some of the presbyteries in the Church of Scotland as tyrannical in his time as well. That might be hard to believe for some of you, but he did. He very much was for personal liberty, very congregationalistic in a sense. And you'll see that come out in the poem as well, just in the concept of God as the monarch and Satan as the tyrant, Satan accusing God as being tyrannical, all of those things. The nature of evil itself. So, there's a conception of dualism in some philosophical traditions where good and evil are both just these high powers that are equal to one another. But Milton is not going to see it that way. He sees the nature of evil as, um, you know, Augustine's concept of privatio boni here, or privation of the good. He's going to see evil as not being created by God, but as a corruption of the good things that God created. If you're in the book club right now with Andrew Snyder and other Mythic Mind patrons and fellows, you'll definitely come across this if you're reading the Confessions and discussing it right now. Augustine mentions it there and in other works, but evil is it's a privation of the good. It's a corruption of the good. God didn't create it, and that is absolutely the view that Milton is putting into this poem. See chapter 10 of C.S. Lewis's preface of Paradise Lost if you want to read on Milton's relationship with Augustine and how he is drawing from that long time, over 1,000-year-old at his time, Augustinian tradition. So now I'm going to just ask some questions, and some of these they pretty much all directly tie in with the themes, but I want to put some of these questions out there. Again, these are things to just chew on, reflect on, meditate on as you are reading, and hopefully even in some sense rereading the poem as we go through this class. What were Adam and Eve meant to be? Were they supposed to grow in knowledge over time? Would there have eventually been a time where they could have been ready to partake of and ingest the knowledge of the tree of good and evil? What is the role of procreation before the fall? Were Adam and Eve supposed to procreate? If so, why didn't they have any children before the fall? How long were they there? How did they not have children? Did they even engage in sexual intercourse? Were they abstinent? Was that the way that they didn't have children? If Eve could get pregnant, what would labor, delivery, and childbirth look like? As in Genesis 3, we see that there's labor and toil and pain that's going to be multiplied in the process of childbirth. But what would that have looked like before the fall? What would parenting have looked like before the fall? Like, how would it look like to have these unfallen, sinless parents and children? Imagine what that would look like. Could Adam and Eve have never fallen? Was it possible that they could have never actually fallen, and that we never would have needed Jesus to come down incarnate and to save us from our sins via his life, death, and resurrection? Is that possible? Could they have never fallen at all? Could they have freely chosen to not disobey, just as they unfortunately freely chose to disobey? Is it possible at all that this could have happened? Or did God actively will for it to happen so that one day the monomyth and the eucatastrophe of Christ could occur? Did Adam and Eve have free will at all? Was their free will libertarian? Did they have some sort of compatibilist form of free will in accordance with God's sovereignty? Did God ordain the fall? Did he actively will for this to happen? If so, does that mean that it was fated? And if so, does that mean that all of humanity is deterministic in a sense? Do we not have a choice on whether to obey or disobey God to attain salvation through the work of Christ ultimately? Do we choose any of that, or is it all elected or predestined? And Milton's not going to use that concept, predestination and election, in the Calvinistic terms. He's going to sort of cash that out in a different way. We can talk about that another time, though. Shifting towards the character of Satan. Why is Satan so charismatic? Why does he get so much screen time or so much of the text? Like, why is he such a prominent character in this? Does Milton want us to relate to him? Is that why he's a prominent character? Or did Milton have some strange fascination with Satan, as the romantic poets William Blake and a little later Percy Shelley accused him of almost basically being some closet satanic fanatic of some sort? Is that true? Is there merit to their claims, or are they misunderstanding and misinterpreting the literary quality of Satan in this? And this is important to contrast with Dante, who basically makes just Satan a hideous, disgusting, pathetic monster at the bottom of Inferno, in the ninth, the lowest circle of Dante's Inferno, Dante's hell. He's half frozen, he's static, he can't do anything, and he's continually in active rebellion, just like Milton's Satan. But Milton's Satan he has a swagger about him. He's charismatic. He's cunning. He's very dynamic rather than static. He's constantly moving around and doing things. Why is that? Why isn't he static? Why is he so dynamic in Paradise Lost? What does Milton's portrayal of Adam have to say about masculinity? What does portrayal of Eve have to say about femininity? Themes that we see in C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, unfallen masculinity, and in Paralandra, unfallen femininity, especially with like the Green Lady. We see this a lot. There's going to be parallels between the Unman and the Green Lady, as well as there's going to be with Satan and Eve in Paradise Lost. Absolutely a direct influence, by the way. Is Eve representative of every woman to Milton, or is she just a character in the story? So is she an archetype? Is he saying something universal about women with Eve, or is he merely saying some things about women, or some things just about her character? And to give you an example of what I mean from here, think of Jane Studdock and That Hideous Strength, if you've read it. If not, you should absolutely read it. Here's a shameless plug for that. But there's a debate whether Jane represents Lewis's vision of female academics as a whole, if Jane's a symbol for that, or if she's merely just an instantiation or just a character in a story who happens to be a female academic with certain circumstances, a certain personality, certain dispositions and struggles, or etc. Some female academics actually dislike the way that Jane is portrayed in this for this reason, but others will say that she's not representative of all female academics. She's just a certain type of female academic as a character in the story. I agree with the latter on that one, but not here to parse that out or debate that. Just an interesting thought I know there's many Lewis fans probably signing up for this course, many who have read the Ransom trilogy, so I'm throwing those out there as examples. All right, so I just wanted to talk about some interpretive challenges now. These are just more questions. I know I'm throwing just a ridiculous amount of questions at you. These aren't supposed to be things that you're answering on the spot. These are things that I want you to be thinking about throughout the course. And you might answer some just to find out, in classic academic fashion, that as you answer these questions, you get answers only to receive more questions that spawn. It's kind of like a hydra. You cut off the head, more heads spawn. That's how these things work, and that's why it's such a great book, right? Because you can just endlessly ask questions and never know all the answers at the end of the day. The amount of scholarship is just enormous, and will just continue to go on and on and on. The mark of a great book, truly. So just some questions about the interpretation itself. How does one imagine a prelapsarian world? I'm a fallen creature. I'm finite. I don't know what it's like to be born in a time where sin and death hadn't entered the world, as I have that in common with every person who will ever watch this video and listen to me talk about it. Everybody who is not Adam and Eve, Christ is obviously born through the Immaculate Conception sinless, so he's an exception here too. But Adam and Eve they're not God, but they're unfallen humans, right? And they exist in Eden. So Milton is a fallen creature just like we are, right? So how does that work? How can he imagine a prelapsarian world properly? Are there limitations to that? Are there going to be struggles to that? How does he deal with that? How does he handle that? Should he even be trying and attempting to imagine the prelapsarian world, right? Like, should he be doing that? The same thing you could go with C.S. Lewis with, um, Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, where he's imagining these unfallen worlds. And does C.S. Lewis do that in a better way than Milton, or does Milton do that in a better way? Does Milton take it too far in some ways, and how we can imagine that? We see another influence here, and I'm drawing a lot of parallels to Dante for a reason, but in Paradiso, which is the third and final part of Dante's Divine Comedy, he he leaves Eden, the earthly paradise, which sits at the very top of Mount Purgatorio. That's the setting of the second part of the poem, Purgatorio or Purgatory. And he ascends out of Eden into the medieval cosmos, the spheres, the heavens, if you may. And Dante arrives on Luna, or what we would know today as the moon. And as soon as he gets there, he's struggling to comprehend things. He's struggling to see things. He's having a really hard time putting all of his experiences from the Paradiso into words in the poem Paradiso, and that's because he's a human and he's limited in a sense. Even if he's been purified, he's struggling with that, and that's different than, in a sense, than Paradise Lost. But it's also not, because John Milton is going to write parts of the story that take place outside of time. They take place in God's transcendence, in the Empyrean, right, where he is outside of time, he's outside of space, he's outside of the cosmos. How does Milton deal with that? How does he imagine that as a finite human being dealing with an infinite being, aka God? Like, how does he handle that? All things just to consider. And so that kind of leads me to my next question and challenge: is how do we deal with a poem that takes place both outside of time and within time? So, like a drama, Paradise Lost has scenes, but it is not always clear when the scene shifts. So you see this in Shakespeare. The editions we have today, they have acts and various scenes that takes place within the act of the play. Usually it's a five act drama with multiple scenes within each act. You see usually scene shifts are clearly articulated in things like Sophocles' Oedipus cycle, or Aeschylus's Orestia, or in some of Euripides' tragedies. But a lot of the editions, at least any of the ones I've seen, don't have this in Paradise Lost. So how do we understand a scene shift? We don't have the clear scene shifts as much in Paradise Lost, and so this requires a lot of careful attention. And I kind of touched on this in the last one, but how do we take place? How do we understand what's taking place between the Godhead, where God the Father and God the Son, both characters in this poem, they're having a dialogue with one another? How are we supposed to handle that and deal with that? How can Milton even know that? Interpretive challenges. How are we supposed to understand whose perspective to read from? And are there some parts? There are some parts from Satan's perspective. There are some parts from God's perspective. How do we imagine and interpret those properly? All things to consider as you dive in and ponder these things reading throughout the poem. All right, so we've posed a lot of questions. Those are maybe too many, maybe not, but I hope those are really helpful for just kind of where to aim your focus and how to think about Paradise Lost. Now it's time to talk more about the characters of the poem. So, first and foremost, God the Father is a character in the poem. God the Son is a character in the poem. Milton is not. He doesn't reject the Trinity, so he does believe that God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit are all, all share the divine essence. They're all fully God, but they're all distinctly their own persons in the Godhead. But these are God the Father and God the Son are going to take up the role of the dialogue within the Godhead. Satan is a major character, like I said before, makes created a lot of controversy because Satan, the the king of hell and the king of the demons, is essentially a main character in this drama. He's portrayed as the main antagonist, if you may, but he gets a lot of light. There's a lot of a focus on him, right? He's almost like a Byronic hero in a sense, a pre-Byronic hero, and Lord Byron, with like Don Juan and other works, most likely did draw influence from this, as the Romantics talked about Milton quite a bit. More on that another time, perhaps. Um, Beelzebub is a character. He's not another name for Satan in this. He is Satan's right hand man. He's his second in command, and he gets a scene with Satan right at the beginning of book one. Um, Satan has some followers who are other named characters. These are basically like his generals in a sense, and they're going to give speeches at the Infernal Council in Book Two and talk about how to best to get back at God for defeating them and banishing them to hell. So we have Belial, Mammon, Moloch, and Mulcaber, and Mulcaber, of course, is an allusion to King Vulcan in Roman mythology, also Hephaestus in Greek mythology. Those are usually interchangeable names. And he's the god of forge and smithery in Roman mythology, just as Hephaestus is in Greek mythology. So that name is another name for King Vulcan, and there's some allusions here to be gleaned, perhaps, as he's the builder of the Palace of Pandemonium. But pay strong attention to the motives and what these characters are getting at when they have this sort of council in Book Two. It's fascinating to get there. Excited to get there and talk about it with you all. So sin and death are each literally a character in this poem. Death you might think of like personified as the Grim Reaper, but Michael says that death has many faces. An interesting thing to consider there. Other characters, of course, Adam and Eve, are human characters, are our first parents, as Milton will call them. They're basically, in a sense, the protagonists of this story. And the angels, of course, are important characters in the story. Literary critic Northrop Frye, in his essay The Story of All Things, says, "The angelic order is there to provide models for human action. They form a community of service and obedience, often doing things meaningless to them, except that as the will of God they have meaning." The angels here, there's a lot we could say about Milton's angels and his angelology, but the characters are supposed to be, they're representing obedience to God. Obedience and disobedience are motifs in this poem, and Milton is absolutely showing the angels as basically exemplars and paragons of virtue and obedience to God fully. They can't fall away because they'll be like Satan's demons, and they don't get redeemed like humans do, as many theologians have believed. So the angels in this poem are Gabriel, then Raphael, who's going to be Adam's teacher before the fall. He is essentially a historian. He's going to use history to try to educate Adam and prepare him to not fall, and warn him that Satan is coming as a serpent. Uriel is another angel. Abdiel is an angel. I know Abdiel is mentioned in I can't remember. It might be Baruch or Tobit, one of the deuterocanonical books. Obviously, if you're a Roman Catholic, that's going to be a part of the biblical canon. For Protestants, it's more extra biblical, but I believe he's mentioned in one of those. I can look into that later. I'm sorry, I did not write that one down. But it's actually one of my favorite character moments in Paradise Lost is when Abdiel stands up alone against Satan and all his demons, is basically says, "No, I'm not going to do this, and you guys shouldn't rebel against God." This is before they actually enact and engage warfare against God and the obedient angels. And Abdiel serves as basically the model of Christian virtue and the cardinal virtue of fortitude or courage, one who is wisely standing up against evil. He's not being a coward, but he's also not exercising a false form of courage and being a rash fool. No, he's properly in that Aristotelian mean between the two extremes, and he's faithful, he's courageous, he's exercising fortitude. I did write about this. I wrote a piece called Abdiel the Faithful, a celestial model of Christian fortitude. You can find that on my Substack. You can also find it in a PDF on the course page. Highly recommend that. Not to shamelessly plug my own work, but it's nothing scholarly, but it's about 1,500 words or so to kind of talk about Abdiel and that scene. When you get to book 5, maybe go give that a read, and I hope we can talk about it further. Michael, another character in this. Michael's the one who's responsible and tasked by God to kick them out of Eden, but he's also tasked with how to educating Adam and preparing him for life outside of Eden, fallen life. And he's going to teach him about the history of his descendants, sort of looking forward down the corridors of time of what's to come with his people and the hope that's ultimately going to come through Jesus Christ, and giving him that theological virtue of hope. Okay, I have said a lot here about the poem, about this magnificent work, and I just wanted to close with some advice for how to read Paradise Lost. Um, some really kind of practical tips for just how to go through the poem. I hope these are helpful to you as they've been helpful to me. I did not do these the first time I read them. I had a professor at Memoria College recommend this to me, and I did it the second time that I read the poem, and it was extremely helpful, to say the least. So, first off, and I did do this one the first time, actually. The other ones I didn't do, but annotate the work. Always annotate a great book. Write in the margins. Write questions. Write answers. Circle words that you don't understand. Maybe look some of them up. Keep a journal of quotes that you love, and perhaps even commit these to memory. The beauty of memory, though our memory is fallen and fickle and fails us at times, if you memorize poetry, you take the poems with you wherever you go. And there's some beauty about that, where, like, first of all, you don't have to have a conversation with somebody and say, "Hold on, let me look up this thing that T.S. Eliot said one time. Let me look up this poem," and then sit there on your phone and try to Google it. No, how profound is it if you can just recite those words from memory? Recite things from Paradise Lost and pull them out in real life scenarios and conversations with friends and family and others. That's a magnificent and underrated thing. Perhaps if you are like me and you like to occasionally unplug and go backpacking out in the woods where you don't have reception, you don't lose Paradise Lost just because you don't have a copy of it with you, because you've kept it up here, you've committed it to memory, and that poem can essentially not leave you in a way. Okay, so here's some advice that did come from my professor at Memoria College. So, write the name of the speaker in the margins every time there's a new speaker in the poem. This is an easy way to just keep track of who's talking. It's not always so easy to do that. It's not like most of the time if you go to Barnes and Noble today and pick up like a fantasy or sci-fi novel or something, it's usually pretty easy to keep track of that. And I don't find that to be the case with Paradise Lost. Furthermore, with that, write in quotation marks where they begin speaking, and write the ending quotation marks at the end of their speech. This helps you to keep track of where they're speaking and where they're not. Some editions might have some quotation marks in them, but I haven't seen any that have them for every speech. So it helps you to know when somebody's actually talking, and when there's just a descriptive, poetic narrative about what's happening. And then thirdly and finally with this goes hand in hand with the speaker. Write the setting out. Every time the setting changes, there will be multiple settings at times within just one book of Paradise Lost. So write that. You're going to get a description of when the setting changes. Write the setting. Write, oh, they're in Eden now. Now they're in heaven and the angels are talking. Now they're within the Godhead, and perhaps even in the Empyrean, in the transcendent realm that goes beyond all the cosmos. Right when they're in hell, when Satan's talking to his demons, or when he's at the gates of hell trying to get out. Keep track of all these things. It's good to note that at the end of the day, and I think that'll be extremely helpful especially when you try to revisit things and reread things for further comprehension. That'll be extremely helpful. And just remember, if you can't get over the writing on a book thing, write in your books, especially the hard ones, and don't see rereading a book with notes in it as a bad thing. See it as a good thing, because if you come back and there's questions that you or things you wrote down and you think, oh, that was stupid, that was foolish, I wasn't thinking about this right. Celebrate that. You know why? Because that's growth. That means you've learned something since your last visit, and you will grow in every um, revisitation of a great book, and it's wonderful to be able to see your progress with that. So don't look at that as a bad thing. Look at it as a good thing and a beautiful thing. You are growing in your intellectual life and journey, and that is wonderful. Anyway, this has been rather lengthy. This is the longest video I'm going to record for these introductory videos, but this is the most important one and the one that you would want to pay the most attention to and hopefully take notes on. I hope this has been really helpful, though, overall, and I really look forward to our journey through Paradise Lost together this semester. Thank you, and God bless.
All right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching over on YouTube. And thank you to Josh Traylor again for sharing this course with us. Now, if you enjoy this material and you want to get more of it, you want to get the entire course, including the live discussions that were recorded at the time, you want to get all of that right away, then you have a way to do that. Just head over to Josh's Patreon and you can purchase the course in the shop, give you all the material right away, and also provide him with some support. Whether you continue through the podcast or whether you continue through his material directly, if you appreciate this material, strongly encourage you to give him some support, help to reimburse him some for the time that he put into this course. And I'll put that link in the show notes. Well, that is it for now. The next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be over on Mythic Mind Games, as I continue to share some of the Elder Scrolls material from the Elder Scrolls in Philosophy course that I led. And I believe the next thing coming out over there is going to be Friday on my Oblivion and Philosophy video. And so that's what's happening there. And then over back on the main Mythic Mind podcast, the next thing will be on Monday as we continue with Beowulf. All right. Well, that is it for now. Until next time, Godspeed.